The autumn wind swept across the Wyoming plains like it had something to prove, dragging dust and dry grass across the land, as if trying to erase everything in its path. Redemption Creek sat in the middle of it all, a small town holding on by stubborn will alone. Wooden buildings leaned into the wind, and men walked like they had learned long ago not to fight it. Jacob Harlow stood on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching the street with the quiet confidence of a man who had already beaten everything this land had thrown at him. At 35, he was one of the richest ranchers in the territory. The Double H Ranch stretched farther than most men could ride in a day. People respected him. Some feared him, and most kept their distance. Not because he was cruel, but because there was something cold about him. "Another auction today," Tom Brennan said, stepping beside him and spitting into the dirt. Jacob didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of whiskey, eyes still on the street. These auctions had become normal in Redemption Creek. Widows, abandoned women, desperate souls, standing on a wooden platform, waiting for someone to buy them a future. It was ugly, but in the West, ugly things survived. "New one in town," Tom added. "Widow. Nobody's seen her face." That made Jacob glance over. "What do you mean nobody's seen her?" "All black clothes, veil, gloves, like she's hiding from the world, or the world's hiding from her." Jacob said nothing, but something in his chest shifted. Inside the saloon, men laughed. Outside, the auction platform was already being set. And then Judge Morrison's voice cut through the noise. "All right, gentlemen, let's begin." The crowd gathered fast. Jacob stayed back at first, leaning against the post. He had never taken part in these things. He didn't need to. But then the women were brought out. He recognized most of them. Sarah Mills, Betty Donovan, young Annie Peterson. And then she stepped forward. The widow. The entire crowd went quiet. She was covered head to toe in black. A thick veil hid her face completely. Not even a shadow of her features showed. Her hands were gloved, her posture straight, her presence different. She didn't shrink like the others. She stood, still, like she refused to break. "Starting bid, $20, the judge called. Silence. No one moved. $10? Still nothing. Whispers spread. What's she hiding? Probably ugly as sin. Or worse. Jacob felt something tighten in his jaw. He didn't know why. But he stepped off the porch and started walking toward the crowd. That's when Buck Watson's voice rang out from behind. "Hey, Harlow!" Jacob didn't even have to turn. He already knew trouble was coming. Buck walked forward with a grin that never meant anything good. "I'll make you a bet," Buck said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "I bet you can't get that widow to show what she's hiding." Laughter spread through the crowd. Jacob's eyes hardened. "I'm not interested." Buck leaned closer. Or maybe the great Jacob Harlow is scared. That did it. The crowd leaned in, waiting, watching, judging. Jacob exhaled slowly, then looked back at the woman on the platform. Still standing, still silent, still alone. $200, Buck said. "You get her to reveal herself before sunrise." Jacob felt every eye on him. His pride, his name, his reputation, all hanging in the air. $300, Jacob said. The crowd erupted. "Done," Buck shouted. And just like that, it was no longer about the woman. It was about the bet. Jacob stepped forward. $75, he called. Heads turned. The judge blinked in surprise. 75. Going once. 100. Another man shouted. Jacob didn't even look at him. 200! Silence. No one followed. The judge slammed the gavel. Sold! Just like that. The woman in black belonged to Jacob Harlow. The crowd began to laugh and whisper again, already imagining what would happen next. Jacob walked up to the platform. For the first time, when he stood face to face with her, he couldn't see her. But somehow, he felt like she was looking straight through him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, offering his hand. She hesitated, then slowly placed her gloved hand in his, and he felt it. She was trembling. "My name is Clara," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but it carried something heavy inside it. Jacob helped her down and led her to his wagon. The entire town watched them leave, like they were heading towards something they couldn't wait to talk about. As they rode out, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, "What was the bet?" Clara asked. Jacob tightened his grip on the reins. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." Her voice was calm. Too calm. He exhaled. "They bet I couldn't get you to reveal your face and be my wife before sunrise." Silence. Then, a quiet laugh. Not happy. Not soft. "Something broken. How unfortunate for them," she said. Jacob frowned slightly. "You're not afraid?" Clara turned her veiled face toward him. "No, Mr. Harlow." A pause. Then, "I've already lost everything that matters." The words hit harder than he expected. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The ranch came into view as night began to fall. Big, strong, built to last. But for the first time, it didn't feel as solid as it once did. Jacob helped her down. She didn't wait for him, didn't look at him, just walked inside like a shadow that had finally found somewhere to rest. That night, Jacob sat alone in his room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, coming down the hallway. A knock. Jacob stood up. "Come in." The door opened, and Clara stepped inside. Still dressed in black. Still hidden. But something had changed. "I think we should finish this," she said. Her voice was steady. But her hands, they were shaking. Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, something he didn't understand yet. Clara stepped closer to the lamp. Then, slowly, she reached up and began to remove her veil. Jacob didn't move, didn't breathe, then didn't blink, because something deep inside him whispered, this moment would change everything. The lamplight flickered gently against the walls as Clara's fingers trembled at the edge of her veil. Jacob stood motionless, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on her every movement. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside the room, the silence felt heavier than any storm. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Clara said softly. Her voice carried no anger, only quiet resignation. Slowly, she removed the outer veil, letting the heavy black fabric fall to the floor. Beneath it remained a finer mesh that still concealed her face. Jacob could now see the faint outline of her features, the curve of her cheek, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "You don't have to do this," Jacob said quietly, his voice lower than usual. Clara shook her head. "You paid for this moment, Mr. Harlow, and you made your wager. It is only fair that I keep my part." She reached up again, her hands shaking slightly as she removed the second veil. For the first time, Jacob saw her face clearly through the lamplight. She was beautiful, not in the delicate, a fragile way he had expected, but with a quiet strength that seemed to shine from within. Her gray eyes held a depth of sorrow that spoke of grief too heavy for words. A faint scar traced along her temple, disappearing into her hairline, but it did nothing to diminish her presence. Jacob stared, surprised by the sudden tightness in his chest. Clara watched his reaction carefully, waiting for the disgust she had learned to expect from strangers. But Jacob did not turn away. Instead, he took a step closer. "You're not what they imagined," he said softly. A bitter smile touched her lips. "They rarely are." She hesitated, then reached up once more, her fingers moving to the back of her head. With a slow, deliberate motion, she removed her wig. The room fell into absolute silence. Jacob froze. At the firelight illuminated the truth she had hidden from the world. Beneath the wig, her scalp bore the marks of terrible burns, patches of scarred skin where her hair had once been. The fire had taken much from her, leaving behind evidence of pain no words could fully describe. Clara held his gaze, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. "This is the woman you won," she said. "Does your victory still feel satisfying?" Jacob's throat tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, not with shock or revulsion, but with something deeper, something she had not seen in years. Understanding. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, then exhaled slowly. 14 months ago, my husband and son died in a fire. Our home, our lives, burned to ashes. I survived, though sometimes I wished I hadn't." Her voice did not tremble, but her hands did. Jacob stepped closer, careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You don't have to hide here," he said quietly. "Not in my home." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You don't feel cheated? The bet? The town's expectations?" "The bet was foolish," Jacob interrupted firmly. "I regret it now." Clara searched his face, uncertain. "Most men would be disgusted." "Most men are fools," he replied. For the first time, her expression softened. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the wig she still held. "I wore this to survive," she admitted. "In Kansas, after the fire, people stared, whispered. I could not bear it. So I hid. I hid until there was nothing left but the shell of a woman who once had a family." Jacob felt a quiet ache in his chest. He had seen grief before, on battlefields and in lonely homesteads, but never had he seen it worn so openly. "You are stronger than any of them," he said gently, "and braver than I deserve." Clara looked back at him, her gray eyes shining in the lamplight. "You are not what I expected either, Mr. Harlow." "Jacob," he corrected softly. A long silence settled between them, no longer heavy, but filled with something new, something fragile and uncertain. Clara placed the wig carefully on the table, as if setting down a burden she had carried too long. "What will you tell them tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Jacob straightened, his voice steady. "I will tell them I lost the bet, that you chose to keep your privacy, as is your right, and if anyone dares to question you, they will answer to me." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You would protect me? Even now?" "Especially now," he said. She stared at him, searching for deceit, but found none. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. "I do not understand you," she whispered. Jacob allowed himself a faint smile. "I'm not sure I understand myself either, but I know one thing. This ranch is yours as long as you wish to stay, not as a purchase, not as a prize, but as a guest under my protection." For the first time in months, Clara felt something unfamiliar stir within her heart. Hope. She reached for the veil on the chair, but hesitated. "May I remain as I am, without hiding?" Jacob nodded. "You never have to hide again." Clara drew a slow breath, and standing tall despite the scars that marked her past. She no longer felt like a ghost wrapped in black, but like a woman stepping back into the world. "Thank you, Jacob," she said softly. He inclined his head, his voice warm. "Rest now. Tomorrow will bring enough challenges of its own." As she turned to leave, the lamplight caught her features once more, illuminating both her scars and her strength. Jacob watched her walk away, aware that the bet, the auction, and everything that had brought them together had changed him in ways he could not yet understand. Outside, the wind carried the promise of dawn, and inside the Double H Ranch, two wounded souls stood on the edge of something neither had expected. Something fragile, something powerful, something that might, in time, become love. Morning came slowly over the Wyoming plains, it painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pale blue. Clara stood at the window of the blue room, watching the sunlight stretch across the land that had begun to feel strangely familiar. For the first time in many months, she had slept without fear. Downstairs, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched. He had spent most of the night thinking about the woman who had walked into his life through pride and foolishness, and who had somehow changed everything without even trying. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Clara entered the room quietly, wearing a simple dress Maria had prepared for her. She no longer wore her veil or wig. The morning light touched her face gently, revealing both her scars and her quiet strength. "Good morning," she said softly. Jacob stood immediately. "Good morning, Clara." For a moment, but neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer awkward, but filled with something unspoken, something new. "I suppose Buck Watson will come today," Clara said, her voice steady, "to see if you've won your wager." Jacob nodded. "He will, but he won't find what he expects." Clara met his gaze. "You intend to tell him you lost?" "I intend to tell him that the bet was foolish and beneath me," Jacob replied firmly, "and that no man has the right to demand anything from you." Her expression softened, touched by a warmth she had not felt in a long time. "You are a better man than you pretend to be, Jacob Harlow." Before he could respond, the sound of horses approached the ranch. A moment later, Buck Watson's voice echoed outside. "Morning, Harlow. I came to collect my winnings." Jacob stepped onto the porch, the Clara standing just behind him. Buck dismounted with a smug grin, followed by two other ranchers, eager for gossip. "Well," Buck said, "did you win your bet?" Jacob's voice was calm but firm. "No, I did not." Buck blinked, surprised. "You're telling me the widow refused?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. "She chose to keep her dignity, and I chose to respect it." Murmurs spread among the men. Buck's grin faded, replaced by confusion and irritation. "You're throwing away $300 over a woman's pride?" "I'm preserving my own," Jacob replied quietly. Clara stepped forward then, her head held high, her scarred face uncovered in the morning light. The men fell silent, their expressions shifting from curiosity to stunned realization. "This is the woman you wagered over," Buck said slowly, his voice faltering. Clara met his gaze without fear. And I am no one's prize, Mr. Watson." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Buck cleared his throat, his arrogance gone. "Well, seems I misjudged the situation." He tipped his hat awkwardly. "Good day to you both." As the men rode away, the dust of their departure settled into silence. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They will talk," she said quietly. "They always do," Jacob replied. "But they will also remember that you faced them without fear." Days turned into weeks, and life at the Double H Ranch settled into a steady rhythm. Clara found purpose in tending the garden, her hands coaxing life from the soil just as she had begun to rebuild her own. The ranch hands treated her with quiet respect, and Maria's warm presence made the house feel like a home. But Jacob watched her from the porch one afternoon, the Wyoming sun catching the strands of her hair as she worked. He had built his life on strength and solitude, but now the ranch felt different, alive in a way it had never been before. "You've brought something to this place," he said, joining her in the garden. Clara smiled faintly. "Perhaps we both have." He hesitated, then spoke with quiet sincerity. "Clara, I know we began under strange circumstances, but somewhere between that auction and today, you became important to me, more important than I expected." Her heart stirred at his words. "You have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, Jacob. A place to belong." He reached for her hand gently. "Then stay, not because you must, but because you want to." Clara looked at the ranch stretching before them, and at the land that had witnessed her sorrow, and now her healing. She thought of her past, of the fire that had taken everything, and of the man standing beside her who had offered her a future without asking for anything in return. "I will stay," she said softly, "not as a widow in mourning, but as a woman ready to live again." Jacob's smile was warm, filled with relief and hope. "Then we'll build something here together." Seasons changed, and Redemption Creek slowly accepted Clara as one of their own. The whispers faded, replaced by quiet admiration for the woman who had faced her scars without shame and stood strong beside the man who had defended her honor. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Jacob led Clara to the porch. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, painted in shades of gold and amber. "I've spent years building this ranch," he said, "but it never felt complete until you came." Clara's eyes softened. "You helped me find my courage again. For that, I will always be grateful." Jacob took her hands in his. "Gratitude is not what I'm asking for, Clara. I'm asking for your heart, if you are willing to give it." Her breath caught. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, wrapping the moment in quiet magic. "I thought my heart had died in that fire," she whispered. "But you proved me wrong." She stepped closer, her voice steady and full of emotion. "Yes, Jacob Harlow, my heart is yours." He pulled her gently into his arms, their first kiss soft and filled with promise. It was not born of a wager or circumstance, but of understanding, respect, and the fragile hope that had grown between them. As night fell over the Wyoming plains, the lights of the Double H Ranch glowed warmly in the distance. The land that had once witnessed loneliness and grief now held something far stronger. "Love," Clara stood beside Jacob on the porch, her scars no longer symbols of pain, but of survival and strength. Together, they faced the vast horizon, ready for whatever the future would bring. In the Wild West, life was never easy. But sometimes, in the harshest places, the most beautiful stories were born. And under the endless Wyoming sky, a rich rancher and a scarred widow found something neither had expected: a new beginning.